Shalom, everyone. We finished the book of Job, and so now I'm here to give an introduction to Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, just like I did for the introduction to the book of Job. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll try to speak up. I don't have a microphone, so I'm just using my iPhone's mic, and hopefully that's good enough. But why are we doing these introductions? Well, it's important to have the context of the scriptures anytime we're reading a whole book, especially. Well, anytime we're reading the scriptures, but when we're reading a book, we need the context of the book. Just like when we're reading a verse, we need the context of the verse, and so on and so forth. So we thought it'd be a good idea. The leaders thought it'd be a good idea and asked if I would do an introduction to each book as we start each new book. So we finished Job, and thank you all for hanging in there for the 42 chapters. That's a tough book, and we had lots of great discussion. And I really think Abba pulled out a lot of important things for us regarding how to respond to pain and suffering. So, of course, we're looking forward to each new book that we open up and see how the Lord leads and what He's going to teach us. So, this book is the Song of Songs, or Shir HaShirim in Hebrew, and we'll go ahead and get started and do this introduction. So, again, why are we reading this book right now? We were going through the Torah cycle and then started going through just the rest of the Tanakh from Joshua all the way to Malachi. But then partway through we felt like, well, maybe we should do these a little bit more chronologically, again, for context's sake. And so we went back and we read Job. As you can see, the Torah and Job is the time of the patriarchs, is the setting of those stories, of those narratives. Job around the time of Abraham, and then the patriarchs all the way up to the time of Moses. Then we enter the period of the judges. So Joshua, of course, the judges, the book of Ruth during that time. And then we enter the period of the monarchy, the kings. So, of course, Samuel anoints King David, who writes the Psalms. Then we have the books of the kings, all the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. And during this time, of course, Solomon is living, writing Proverbs. And here's our book we're studying, Song of Songs. And then next book we will enter is Ecclesiastes, also believed to have been written by Solomon. And then the chronicler gives another retelling of all the situation that was happening in Israel and Judah during the times of the kings. And of course, this is when the prophets, a lot of them are speaking as well. Then there's the exile to Babylon, of course, the return from Babylon, during which other prophets are speaking. And then we have the period of the Messiah and the apostolic writings. So that's where we are right now in the chronology. And a little tidbit I found that in Jewish tradition, the Song of Songs is often read at Pesach, at Passover. And as many of you already know, it's a romantic dialogue. And so you can understand why they might read this at Passover, why some might have it in their tradition to read at Passover. Some even believe a little bit more mystically that these were words spoken between the Creator and His people as they came out of Egypt. Of course, that's tradition, not scripture. But that's the reason some read it at Passover, which is kind of cool that we're reading it right now as we enter the holy days on the other end of the year, the fall holy days coming this very week. So a time of intimacy with the Lord, I think it's also appropriate for us. Oops. Okay, where am I? Okay, there we go. Setting. So, as I said, the time of Solomon, in my mind, I always remember David is around 1000 BC, so Solomon's going to be right after that. Some put this date of the setting of these writings around 960 BC, give or take. This is during the time of the unified kingdom. The kingdom has not yet split because that happens after Solomon. So this is the unified kingdom of Israel under Solomon. Jerusalem is mentioned as where the king is living. Some evidence within the text itself, Solomon himself is mentioned 7 times in the text. There's cities mentioned in the north, in Israel, and south, in Judah, like in one statement, in one sentence. Cities that are in these different regions appear in one statement. So it just gives credence to the recognizing the setting that this was before the kingdom was torn apart. Also, a city named Tirzah is mentioned, and if you look in 1 Kings 16, it says that King Omri of Israel, who was a king of the north after the split during 885 to 874, he changed the royal city from Tirzah to the more common city we're familiar with, Samaria. So if Tirzah and Jerusalem are mentioned in one sentence as these great cities, probably during this earlier time of the unified kingdom. Okay, what about the author? I described the setting. Sometimes the date of the writing or the author is later, is after the time of the events that are described in the text. But in this case, many believe the author to be Solomon himself. Verse 1 of chapter 1 says, Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, or of Solomon. So a lot of people think that is enough evidence right there. It just says of Solomon, just like a lot of the songs say of Psalms, say of David, meaning written by David. We'll talk about another possibility here in a minute. Some more evidence of this is that we know of Solomon's wisdom, and a lot of the way that this is written in included in wisdom literature, poetry, gives a little bit of credence to that. That he was knowledgeable in the animal world and in the plant world, that he wrote all sorts of psalms and songs that you can see there is indicated in 1 Kings chapter 4. These are other hints that of Solomon's authorship. There's also similar linguistic parallels with Ecclesiastes and the Proverbs, which are also attributed to Solomon. It does mention in chapter 6, verse 8 of our book that there are 60 queens and 80 concubines. So, of course, he had many more than that, but this could have been maybe earlier on in his reign. But then it brings up the question, okay, how can this male and female voice be speaking to each other in such a way as they are when this male has all these different women at the same time? So some suppose that maybe many of his marriages were political. We know that he was a mighty king, and that's just things that were done, marital alliances between countries and such. So perhaps, we don't know, but just postulating, perhaps many of those marriages were more political and formal rather than intimate and romantic and personal. And this one, with this female that the dialogue which is included in this book, is actually a romantic relationship, and the text records that. So the style and the structure, like I said, this is part of the section of scripture called wisdom literature. So it's very much more of a poetic type of diction that's being used, as opposed to narrative history, like in the Torah, especially Genesis, in the Gospels, where it's just telling a story in more historical narrative. So this is a lot more loose with words and different types of word plays and parts of speech that are very descriptive, but not necessarily exact, and we'll talk about some more of that. So there's no narrative plot, there's no story per se, with a structure that has an introduction and a build-up and a climax of the story and a resolution of the problem and all that sort of thing. It's more like love letters, back and forth, notes, love notes, passed back and forth. There's two primary voices. The male voice, which again is identified as Solomon, who's the groom, the king, and then the female voice, who is identified as a Shulamite. And they believe that's a term for someone who's from the city of Shunem, which is southwest of Galilee, in the tribe of Issachar, who is perhaps a shepherdess, based on some of the descriptions given of her, and of course she's the bride. She's also the predominant voice. The female voice in the Song of Songs is the predominant voice in the 8 chapters of this book. And so some believe that perhaps she was the author, and when it says, this is the Song of Songs of Solomon, it's more like she's been collecting their exchanges and their notes, perhaps, and she's cataloged them of her relationship of Solomon, of her relationship with Solomon. So that's also a possibility. There's actually a third voice that is often called the chorus. Might be the crowd or a group of her friends, the daughters of Jerusalem, for instance. Frequent shifting happens as part of the style of this book, back and forth, the female voice, the male voice, the chorus, back to the female voice, the male voice, back and forth. Kind of like multiple scenes, maybe flashpoints of their growing relationship, or like I said, love notes between the two. It's also indicative of a cyclical and an ongoing, perpetual nature of their growing relationship. Of course, as I mentioned, high use of metaphor, simile, double entendre, which means you say one thing and it means that, but it also means something else that is implied. In this case, sexual innuendo, as we'll talk about more in a sec. So, the theme of this book. What's the point? What's the point of reading this book? What is the author trying to get across? Well, some believe it's completely fiction. Like someone just made all this stuff up and just wrote it as a fiction dialogue between a man and a woman. Other people believe that no, it's history. These are historical figures and we have documentation of their exchanges between each other. And then some people believe that it's an allegory of describing something else, of a higher power, of another order interacting with this creation. So, in my mind, I'm just going to say it seems pretty clear that it's not fiction because we have historical figures being mentioned by name, Solomon and the Shunammite woman, different locations that are specified. So let's just go with start with history. So if we take this document as a historical document of historical people that really lived, and this is their conversation back and forth between each other, if we take that as the Peshat, as the plain reading of the text, then in our scripture we have an example preserved for us of a biblical example of romantic human love and a romantic relationship between a man and woman and husband and wife. It displays the vast dimensions of love. As you read the book, it talks about the ins and outs of love with giving, receiving, seeking, finding, desire and fulfillment, the pleasure of love, and then the pain of loss and separation, and just that multifaceted, all the facets of love that we're familiar with. And it goes through all of them, and you get the sense of these two experiencing all these different facets. The progression of love, as I mentioned before, there's this attraction and courting, and then progressing on to a wedding, and then there's trouble and separation, and then there's resolution of that, and they can be together again and longing for each other. So in that we see that as the book progresses through the 8 chapters, the first four are more like the beginning of the relationship of love, the beginning of love, and then the broadening of love and the maturation of love in the final few chapters. As I said, this gives us an example of the biblical view of sexuality. This is within a marriage context, as is described. What I think is important that it emphasizes this is not a lust situation, the way it's being described. Neither is it asceticism, where anything of a sexual nature is considered base or immoral. It's neither of those. It's not falling into either ditches on either side, but this is an appropriate description that is contained within our scriptures. And I think even the style of the text indicates that. As I was reading, I thought that was a good point, that being written in artistic poetry and using the double entendre language to thinly veil a very clearly sexual conversation between a husband and wife is a very tasteful way to describe and to discuss something that is of a sensitive but beautiful nature. remembering that this is from God. So there is sexual freedom and sexual equality within a marriage relationship. That is beautiful, that God has designed. As we remember from the first couple chapters of Genesis, two were one and they were separated and then brought back together. And the Lord said that the two shall become one flesh. And then all that was done in creation, Jehovah said, was very good. So this is surely of God's design and a beautiful thing. So, but because of this sensitive nature, you can imagine through the history, some thought that this was not appropriate to be part of the Bible, and it was misused. Different people would use it inappropriately and in a vulgar way, and as you can imagine. So attempts were made at allegory. So we talked about fiction, the perspective, the historical perspective. What about the allegorical perspective? Well, if you remember the different Jewish hermeneutics, so Peshat is a plain reading. That would be the historical reading. Remez means reminder. So could these two interacting, this relationship, remind me of something else, somewhere else in Scripture? Drash is basically allegory. This example means something else. And then Sod is more like the mystical, secret, hidden kind of meaning in the text. So this is more the realm of allegory and metaphoric interpretation of the text. The thing about it is it's not so overt as it is in other places in the Bible, like in these different chapters I have listed here, where it's pretty clear that the allegorical example is God to Israel, or God to the Messiah to his body, the bride. It's pretty blatant, that sort of allegorical comparison, whereas it's not that way in this text, which in my opinion again leads more to the historical. This is a narrative between two human individuals in a romantic relationship. But can we see, in addition to that, can we see an allegory in the text? And I think we can, in my opinion. As I have listed here, God in Israel, or Messiah in the body, God in the soul, mentioned is the belief of some, and even a little more esoterically, the male and the female aspects of the divine, which I don't even know how to go more into, because that's not something that I've studied or looked into much. I think that's more on the side of mysticism. But just as an aside, there are interesting passages that refer to God in feminine forms. It's usually masculine forms, but ruach is a feminine noun, for instance. Yeshua is saying that he wanted to gather Jerusalem to himself as a hen gathers her chicks. So there are feminine aspects descriptive of God in the text as well. Just something to keep in mind and not forget. Anti-legomena, that's a Greek word that means spoken against. And this is something that happened both for the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, as well as the apostolic writings. As far as the Tanakh goes, these 5 books were very, very late added to the canon because some considered that they shouldn't be part of Scripture. Kind of incredible if you look at those 5: Ezekiel, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Esther, all for different reasons. As far as Song of Songs goes, as I mentioned earlier, the content being sexual, you can imagine some people didn't want it as part of the scripture. They saw it as inappropriate, and what does this have to do with anything else in the text that's obviously more of a theological and faith nature. That Yehovah and Elohim are not mentioned in the text, in the text of Song of Songs, even once. There is a compound word that contains the suffix Yah, but that's it as far as the 8 chapters. That he's nowhere else mentioned. And then, of course, the Song of Songs isn't quoted anywhere else in all the rest of Scripture. So those are some of the reasons why it was spoken against and considered as part of this group that maybe shouldn't be a part of the text. But eventually it was decided through a long process, it's complicated, that it was part of Scripture and it was accepted. So that's basically the introduction to the Song of Songs. These are just some questions that I thought are important for us to be thinking about before, during, and at the end, after we finish reading the text. Why is this book part of the scripture? Because, as I just said, some people thought it shouldn't be. So for us to be thinking about that, why it has been preserved as part of our canon, as part of our scriptures. What does it teach us about Yehovah? What does it teach us about human love and sexuality in the context of marriage? What contribution does this book make to faith in the God of the Bible, both from a historical vantage point as well as from an allegorical vantage point? So I hope that helps, and look forward to talking more with you all. Love you. Have a good week. Bye.